The scent of pine and damp earth, a fragrance that had once been Mateo's balm, now clung to him like a shroud. 6 months. Half a year since Sarah's laughter last echoed off the rough-hewn walls of their cabin, nestled on the verdant slope of Black Pine Ridge. The fever had swept through her like a wildfire, sweet and merciless, leaving behind an emptiness that consumed the small homestead and the larger man who now rattled within it. His chisels, once extensions of his own fingers, lay abandoned on the scarred pine workbench, gathering a fine film of Appalachian dust. Logs of native cherry, bird's-eye maple, and rich black walnut, chosen with a craftsman's love and anticipation, now seemed like mocking sentinels of a forgotten purpose in the workshop's gloom. Mateo, a man whose hands had once coaxed life and stories from silent wood, found himself struck dumb, his spirit as gnarled and unyielding as a lightning-struck ancient oak. He was 48, his face a road map of mountain sun and quiet sorrow, his dark, deep-set eyes reflecting the brooding, ancient shadows of the Appalachians that cradled his chosen isolation. Sarah had been the light in his quiet world, the one who understood his silences and celebrated the eloquence of his carvings. She loved his intricate songbirds, the delicate petals of his wooden dogwood blossoms. He remembered her hands, flour-dusted, kneading dough on the worn kitchen table, the scent of baking bread a warm counterpoint to the sharper tang of wood shavings from his workshop. He recalled the way she'd hum off-key while tending her small herb garden, the vibrant splash of color it brought to their rustic life. The illness had been brutal, reducing her vibrant energy to a fragile whisper in a matter of weeks, leaving him to watch, helpless, as the light faded from her eyes. The doctor down in Shiloh Gap had shaken his head, murmuring about things beyond his ken. The folks in Shiloh Gap, a sparse constellation of weathered houses, a white steepled church, and a general store that smelled of coffee beans and old wood, mostly kept their distance. They'd known Mateo as a man of few words even when Sarah was alive, one who seemed more at ease with the rustling conversations of the forest than the clipped exchanges of men. Now they offered sympathetic nods and left him to the solitude they assumed he craved. But lately the low hum of gossip in Haskell's general store had taken on a sharper edge. Whispers of poachers, bold and brazen, venturing deeper into the protected lands. Talk of illegally set snares, cruel and indiscriminate, and an unsettling quiet in the hollows where the drumming of grouse and the sight of browsed deer had once been commonplace. Mateo, too, had felt the disquiet. More than once the distant, muffled crack of a rifle had echoed across the ridges, a discordant note in the mountain symphony, grating on his already raw nerves. It was an unwelcome trespass into the sanctuary that no longer felt sacred, not since Sarah had left it. Just last week, scouting for a fallen cedar, he'd found them. Unfamiliar boot prints, deep and sharply defined in the damp earth of a game trail far up the western slope, too deliberate for a casual hiker, too new for an old friend. The mountain felt disturbed, its ancient rhythms disrupted. His grief had erected an invisible wall around his heart, but the encroaching ugliness of the outside world, the greed and carelessness of men, was beginning to seep through the cracks, stirring a dormant anger within him. The forest was his last refuge, and even that seemed under siege. A late spring tempest, vicious and unheralded, clawed its way over the towering peaks of the great Smoky Mountains, spilling into the valleys with the fury of a cornered beast. Rain, thick as thrown gravel, lashed down in near horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked and moaned through the primeval hemlocks and ancient oaks like a host of tormented spirits. Deep within the storm-lashed undergrowth, miles from the oblivious solitude of Mateo's cabin, a drama of life and death was unfolding. A female bobcat, lean to the point of gauntness, her spotted coat plastered to her ribs, raced against the escalating storm in a terror more immediate, more personal. Her name, had the mountain spirits chosen to whisper one, might have been Flicker, for the way the dappled sunlight usually danced upon her exquisitely patterned fur, or perhaps Resilience for the indomitable will that now propelled her. But tonight there was only the suffocating darkness, the stinging rain, and the frantic, desperate drumbeat of her heart against her ribs. One of her forepaws, usually so deft and silent on the forest floor, throbbed with an agonizing, fiery pain. Hours ago, perhaps a lifetime, it had been clamped in the cold, unyielding iron jaws of a poacher's snare. The heavy gauge wire, rusted and brutal, had bitten deep, shearing through fur and flesh, grating against bone before her panicked, Pain-fueled strength had allowed her to wrench herself free. She'd left behind a shred of her own flesh, a testament to her will to survive, but the snare had left its mark, a ragged, bleeding gash that pulsed with every tortured step. Two tiny kids, so young their eyes had barely adjusted to the dim light of their natal den, were her singular focus. They were hidden in a shallow, hastily chosen burrow beneath the massive, uprooted base of a lightning-struck poplar, their survival entirely terrifyingly dependent on her return. The poachers, the two eggs whose scent was a vile miasma of stale sweat, gun oil, and death, were a persistent, insidious threat. Their careless, heavy steps had disturbed the forest floor near her original den only days before, forcing her to move her precious litter prematurely. She had to lead them away, create a chasm of distance between their innocent vulnerability and the poachers' casual malice. The storm, in its blind fury, was both a malevolent adversary and an unlikely ally. It washed away her scent trail, confusing any pursuit, but it also leached her dwindling strength, the cold rain chilling her to the bone, the wind tearing at her like invisible claws. Each blinding flash of lightning illuminated a landscape made alien and hostile by the deluge, familiar landmarks twisted into grotesque shapes. She stumbled, her injured legs screaming in protest, a low, involuntary growl of pain and sheer defiance rumbling deep in her chest. Her cubs. The thought was a burning ember in the freezing storm of her fear. She had to get back to them, or ensure she let any lurking danger far, far from their fragile lives. She didn't know Mateo's cabin existed, was unaware of the solitary man wrestling his own demons within its walls. She only knew she had to keep moving, driven by an instinct as old and unyielding as the mountains themselves, a primal imperative to protect her lineage against the encroaching darkness. The storm, having spent its fury, retreated with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean, glistening under a pale, tentative sun, but also strewn with the wreckage of its passage. Broken branches littered the forest floor like scattered bones, and the creeks ran high and muddy. Mateo, after a restless night punctuated by the wind's mournful symphony and the unsettling rattle of his window panes, stepped out onto his small, covered porch. The air was sharp and cool, heavily scented with bruised pine needles, damp earth, and the clean, ozonic aftermath of the tempest. He cradled a chipped enamel mug of lukewarm coffee, his gaze sweeping his small domain. A large limb from the ancient oak at the edge of his clearing had snapped, landing precariously close to his woodpile. Another chore for a day that already felt too long. As he took a slow sip, his eyes, trained by years of solitary observation, caught a flicker of movement near the shadowy base of his workshop, almost hidden by a tangle of overgrown rhododendron. Not a deer, too low and compact. Not one of the bold raccoons that sometimes raided his trash, too sleek and deliberate. He set his mug down on the porch rail, his senses instantly sharpening. He moved with a woodsman's ingrained caution, his worn boots making little sound on the damp ground. There, huddled against the rough-hewn logs of the workshop's foundation, seeking what little shelter the overhang provided, was the Bobcat. Her beautifully spotted fur was matted and dark with rain and mud, and she was shivering uncontrollably despite the strengthened sun. One forepaw, he saw with a pang, was held unnaturally off the ground, swollen to twice its normal size and caked with a gruesome mixture of dry blood, dirt, and pine needles. Her yellow eyes, pupils narrowed to slits against the nascent light, locked onto him, blazing with a mixture of raw fear, defiance, and an exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from her very bones. A low, guttural growl, more vibration in her chest than an audible sound, rumbled a clear warning. Mateo froze, his breath catching in his throat. His first instinct was a primal jolt of fear, a bobcat, a wild predator, right on his doorstep. This was quickly followed by a wave of weary annoyance. He had enough burdens, enough ghosts. He didn't need this. But then, as he truly looked, he saw past the fierce facade. He saw the desperate tremor that racked her lean body, the almost imperceptible flattening of her ears that signaled terror rather than aggression, the sheer, stubborn grit that must have propelled her, injured and tormented, to this unlikely refuge. He remembered Sarah's quiet, fierce fight, her own stubborn bravery against an unbeatable foe that had stolen her breath. A forgotten chamber in his heart, long walled off by grief, felt a dull, unfamiliar ache of empathy. "Easy now, girl," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, softer than he intended. "Just taking a look. No harm meant." He took a single, tentative step closer. The Bobcat flinched violently, trying to push herself further back against the unyielding logs. A fresh wave of pain contorting her features, her lips drawing back in a silent snarl. He could see the ragged edges of the wound now, inflamed and angry-looking. He knew the protocol. Leave wild animals alone, call the park rangers or wildlife control, whose station was a good 2-hour drive away, assuming they'd even prioritize a single injured bobcat. But the raw, festering wound on her leg, the way she favored it so desperately, the palpable aura of suffering that clung to her, it all screamed of a crisis that wouldn't wait for slow-moving bureaucracy or distant aid. His conscience, a thing he thought long buried with Sarah, stirred uncomfortably. He couldn't just turn his back. Not on this. The days that followed settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm of cautious observation and tentative offerings. Mateo, after much internal debate, decided against immediately calling the authorities. The Bobcat, Flicker, as he'd begun to call her in the privacy of his own thoughts, for that first fleeting glimpse of her, was clearly terrified of humans, and the stress of capture might kill her. Or more pragmatically, the rangers might simply euthanize her given the severity of the injury. He started by leaving a shallow bowl of fresh, cool water from his well, and a small portion of leftover roasted chicken, food he himself had barely picked at, near the edge of the workshop, a good 30 feet from where Flicker remained hunkered down in the shadows beneath the rhododendrons. For the first 2 days, the offerings were pointedly ignored. Each morning he'd find them untouched, though he sensed more than saw that she was aware of his every move when he replenished them. He'd catch fleeting glimpses of her tawny, spotted fur as she shifted deeper into the dense foliage, her golden eyes always watchful, burning with an unreadable suspicion. He took to talking to her during these brief, one-sided encounters, his voice a low, steady murmur that didn't demand a response. He told her about the changing weather, the way the mist clung to the hollows in the mornings, about the stubborn grain in a piece of maple he couldn't yet bring himself to work. Sometimes, in hushed, broken tones, he even spoke of Sarah, her love for the mountain wildflowers, the way her eyes would light up when he presented her with a newly finished carving. He didn't know if the Bobcat understood his words, but the sound of a calm human voice, devoid of threat, seemed to lessen the rigid terror in her posture, if only fractionally. Flicker's condition, however, showed no signs of improvement. If anything, the swelling in her injured leg appeared more pronounced, the surrounding fur matted and discolored. A faint, sickly sweet odor, the unmistakable scent of infection, began to drift on the air when the wind was right, filling Mateo with a growing sense of dread. He knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut that if she didn't get nourishment and her wound wasn't addressed, she wouldn't survive. The thought of her dying so close to his sanctuary, another life lost on his watch, was unbearable. One cool morning, the rising sun painting the mist in the valley with strokes of rose and gold, Mateo decided he had to try something different. He approached her hiding spot more directly than before, moving with painstaking slowness, his hands open and visible. He held out a small, tempting piece of freshly cooked chicken in his outstretched palm. "You gotta eat, Flicker," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You gotta fight this." She watched him, her body coiled like a spring, a low, continuous growl vibrating in her chest, her ears flicked back. He knelt, keeping his profile low and unthreatening, and stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, his arm beginning to ache, his knee protesting against the damp ground. The forest held its breath around them. Then, with excruciating slowness, she dragged herself forward a few inches, her gaze never leaving his, the growl faltering slightly. She sniffed the air delicately, her whiskers twitching. Then, quicker than his eye could follow, she darted her head forward, snatched the meat from his numb fingers, and retreated just as swiftly into the shadows. It was a minuscule victory, a single piece of chicken, but to Mateo, it felt as momentous as the shifting of a mountain. Later that afternoon, as he sat on his porch, idly whittling a piece of scrap pine, he observed Flicker. She was restless, shifting her position frequently, her gaze repeatedly drawn towards the dense, brooding woods that climbed Black Pine Ridge. He heard her make a soft, almost inaudible chuffing sound, a sound that tugged at something deep within him. It wasn't a growl of warning, nor a yowl of pain he'd sometimes hear from a distance. It was different, imbued with a strange, yearning quality. He watched her drag her injured leg, testing it gingerly, her golden eyes fixed on the distant tree line with an intensity that made his own heart ache. He began to suspect, with a dawning, almost unbelievable intuition, that there was more to her desperate presence than just a random, injured animal seeking a moment's respite. That soft, repeated call, that unwavering, longing gaze, it was as if she was calling to something or someone lost in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The fragile bridge of trust between the grieving woodsman and the wounded bobcat was built day by painstaking day, moment by cautious moment, as delicate and precious as the first gossamer webs of morning dew spun across the meadow grasses. Flicker began to take the food Mateo offered more regularly, though always with that lingering wild caution in her golden eyes, always ready to bolt at the slightest unexpected movement or sound. Mateo, in turn, learned the subtle language of her fear and her tentative acceptance. He learned to move with an almost meditative slowness when near her, to keep his voice a low, unthreatening rumble, to never stare directly into her eyes for too long, which she seemed to perceive as a challenge. He started leaving the heavy oak door of his workshop slightly ajar during the day, propped open with a weathered fieldstone. The workshop, redolent with the comforting scents of cedar, pine, and walnut, was warmer and drier than the damp earth beneath the rhododendrons. For several days she ignored the silent invitation. Then one cool, misty evening, as dusk began to settle like a soft gray blanket over the ridge, he peered into the workshop before closing up. There she was, a small, spotted shape curled up on a pile of old burlap sacks in the far corner, a space he'd unconsciously cleared for her. Her injured leg was tucked beneath her, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked almost peaceful. A profound sense of relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over Mateo. He continued to observe her closely. Her strength seemed to be slowly returning with regular nourishment, but the infection in her leg remained a grave concern. The chuffing calls he'd heard her making became more frequent, especially in the quiet hours of dawn and dusk, always directed towards the forested slopes of Black Pine Ridge. He started to spend more time just sitting quietly on an old stump near the workshop, sketching idly in a worn, leather-bound notepad he'd found among Sarah's belongings. He drew the way the light filtered through the leaves, the intricate patterns of moss on the old stone wall, and tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, he began to sketch Flicker herself, the alert set of her ears, the intense focus of her gaze, the subtle ripple of muscles beneath her spotted coat. One late afternoon, while he was mending a piece of harness leather on his porch, he noticed Flicker acting with unusual agitation. She limped to the edge of the clearing, chuffing insistently, then looked back at him, her eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher, desperation, urgency, perhaps even a plea. She repeated the action twice more. On a sudden impulse, a gut feeling that transcended logic, Mateo put down his work. "All right, girl," he said softly. "Show me. What is it you want me to see?" Heart thumping with a mixture of trepidation and a strange anticipation, he rose and followed her, keeping a respectful distance. She led him not directly up the steep incline, but along a faint, barely discernible game trail that contoured along the side of the ridge, a path he rarely used. Her progress was slow, punctuated by pauses where she would stop to rest her injured leg, looking back to ensure he was still following. The forest deepened around them, the familiar sounds of his homestead fading, replaced by the hushed symphony of the deep woods. After nearly half an hour of this slow, deliberate journey, she stopped beneath the massive, gnarled roots of a colossal oak that had been toppled by some long-ago storm, its broken trunk now forming a natural, sheltered overhang. Flicker disappeared for a moment into the shadowy hollow formed by the roots in the earth. Mateo waited, his breath held tight in his chest. Then she reemerged and nudged something forward with her nose. Two pairs of tiny, luminous blue eyes, like chips of fallen sky, blinked up at him from the darkness of the shallow den. Two bobcat kits, exquisitely spotted, no bigger than his two fists clasped together, huddled together on a bed of dry leaves. They were perfect miniature replicas of their mother. Flicker lay down beside them, her body curving protectively around their small, fragile forms. She licked each one gently, then looked up at Mateo, her golden eyes holding an expression of such profound, unbearable vulnerability, such an astonishing depth of trust that it stole his breath and made his own eyes sting with unshed tears. He understood with a clarity that pierced through months of grief-induced fog. She wasn't just showing him her young, she was anointing him their guardian, entrusting him with her most precious secret, the very continuation of her lineage, in an act of faith that transcended the chasm between man and wild. The weight of that trust settled upon him, heavy and profoundly humbling. The discovery of the kits galvanized Mateo. The vague unease he'd felt about the poachers coalesced into a cold, focused anger, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he still possessed awakening with fierce intensity. These weren't just anonymous woods anymore, they were Flicker's nursery, her sanctuary, and by extension his to defend. The very next morning he found it, a freshly set snare, its cruel metal jaws agape and menacing, not half a mile from the kit's den, cleverly concealed along a narrow deer trail. Fury, righteous and potent, surged through him, momentarily eclipsing his sorrow. With grim purpose, his hands, clumsy from months of disuse for such tasks, worked to dismantle the trap, the cold metal a vile contrast to the warm living wood he was accustomed to. He carried the dismantled snare back to his workshop, a tangible symbol of the threat that loomed. He knew a direct confrontation with the poachers was foolish. They were likely armed, and certainly wouldn't appreciate interference from a reclusive woodsman. He had to be smarter, use his intimate knowledge of Black Pine Ridge against them. He began a silent, one-man campaign of counter-surveillance and misdirection. Each dawn, before tending to Flicker and her young, he would patrol a wide perimeter around the den and his own cabin, his eyes scanning for any unfamiliar signs, a broken twig, a scuffed patch of moss, the faintest indentation of a boot print. He found more snares, and one baited leg hold trap, all of which he disabled and removed, his contempt for their indiscriminate cruelty growing with each discovery. He started creating false trails, deliberately scuffing paths that led away from the sensitive areas towards dense, impassable thickets or dangerously steep gullies. He doubled back on his own tracks, brushing them away with a pine bough, leaving a confusing muddle for anyone trying to follow. He even sacrificed a few of his less favored carving blanks, pieces of wood with awkward grains or hidden flaws. He quickly roughed them out into crude animal shapes, a deer silhouette, the hunched form of a turkey, and placed them strategically in clearings or along distant game trails where a fleeting glimpse through the trees might be mistaken for live game, hoping to frustrate the poachers, waste their time, and eventually discourage them from hunting in this particular section of the mountain. During this period of heightened vigilance, Flicker's leg, benefiting from the antibiotics Mateo had painstakingly managed to crush and mix into her food, began to show marked improvement. The angry redness subsided, the swelling decreased, and she started putting more weight on it, her movements becoming more fluid, more like the graceful predator she was. The kits, whom Mateo had privately named Soul, for the sun-dappled patches they loved to play in, and Luna for her slightly rounder face and calmer demeanor, were growing rapidly. Bolder now, and increasingly curious, they would often tumble out of the den to wrestle and play under Flicker's watchful, Amber first with their daily offering of food. He'd sit quietly on a moss-covered log some distance away, sketching them in his notepad, the lines flowing from his charcoal with a newfound confidence and grace that had been absent for too long. The fierce, tender protectiveness of the mother bobcat, the innocent, untamed exuberance of her young, the raw, resilient beauty of the ancient forest. It was all pouring back into him, seeping into the desolate, empty spaces that Sarah's passing had carved within his soul. He wasn't just sketching animals on paper. He was feeling his way back to life, rediscovering the pulse of creation within himself. The mountain, through this unlikely feline family, was breathing its wild, untamed spirit back into him, healing him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Summer unfurled across Black Pine Ridge in a vibrant tapestry of emerald greens, the air thick with the drone of cicadas and the sweet, heady perfume of blooming mountain laurel. Flicker's recovery was, by all appearances, complete. Her limp was now almost imperceptible, a slight favoring of the heel leg that only Mateo's keenly observant eye could detect. Her spotted coat, once dull and matted, was now sleek and glossy, rippling over lean, powerful muscles. The kits, Saul and Luna, were thriving under her expert tutelage. They were nearly half her size now, miniature whirlwinds of spotted fur, their kittenish play increasingly interspersed with serious lessons in stalking, pouncing, and the silent language of the forest. Mateo continued his role as their quiet, unobtrusive guardian and provisioner, his days settling into a new, meaningful rhythm. Early morning patrols for any sign of the poachers, who seemed to have become discouraged, their signs growing fainter and less frequent, leaving food for Flicker and the rapidly growing kits a little further from the den each day to encourage their independence, and then the long, satisfying hours spent in his whir. The scent of cedar, pine, and cherry wood once again filled the air around his cabin, now mingled with the happy music of his chisels and gouges tapping against wood. His carvings were undergoing a profound transformation. He was no longer drawn to the meticulously detailed but emotionally static floral patterns and songbirds that Sarah had so admired. Now his hands sought to capture the raw, untamed essence of the wild creatures he had come to know and respect. A red-tailed hawk, wings outstretched in a moment of soaring freedom. A gray fox, curled asleep in a hidden dell, the epitome of weary repose. And his most ambitious, most personal project yet, a nearly life-size sculpture of Flicker, carved from a magnificent piece of black walnut. He depicted her not as a passive recipient of his care, but as a vigilant matriarch, her head held high and alert, one strong forepaw resting protectively near the implied forms of two small, unseen kits nestled at her feet. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience, her fierce maternal love. One sweltering August afternoon, Mateo was outside his cabin, splitting a stack of oak logs for the coming winter, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar beat in the humid air. He paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and reached for another log. As he bent, a dry, menacing rattle, sharp and chillingly close, sliced through the drowsy hum of insects. Copperhead. His blood ran cold. He froze instantly, his eyes darting, locating the venomous pit viper, coiled defensively near the woodpile, its spade-shaped head raised, tongue flicking, ready to strike. It was not 3 feet from where he stood, effectively cutting off his retreat. He knew any sudden movement would provoke an attack. Before he could even fully process the danger, before his mind could formulate a plan, a tawny, spotted blur launched from the dense foliage at the edge of the woods with breathtaking speed and silence. Flicker. In a streak of concentrated fury, she landed directly on the coiled snake, her teeth, sharp as daggers, sinking deeply into its neck just behind the head. There was a brief, violent thrash, a flurry of fur and scales, and then it was over. Flicker stood over the now limp reptile, her chest heaving slightly, a low growl still rumbling in her throat. She pinned the snake with one paw, gave it a final savage shake, then dropped it contemptuously. She looked directly at Mateo for a long, intense moment, her golden eyes gleaming with an unreadable feral light. Then, as quickly and silently as she had appeared, she melted back into the green sanctuary of the undergrowth, leaving Mateo standing stunned, axe still clutched in his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She had saved him. There was no other interpretation. It wasn't a calculated act of human gratitude, he understood that. It was something far more primal, perhaps a swift territorial defense of her kits, who might have been nearby, or the instinctive reaction of a predator to a perceived threat in her domain. But to Mateo, standing there in the buzzing afternoon heat, the metallic scent of fear still sharp in his nostrils, it felt like a profound reciprocation, a debt unexpectedly and astonishingly repaid. The raw, untamed wildness he had striven to protect had, in a moment of critical danger, unequivocally protected him. That evening he returned to his workshop and worked late into the night on his sculpture of Flicker, his hands shaping the rich walnut with a new reverence, a deeper understanding. He was no longer just a grieving widower passively existing. He was a man who had forged an unspoken sacred pact with the wild heart of the mountain, a man who was, against all odds, vibrantly, intensely alive again. As autumn's cool breath began to sweep down from the high peaks, painting the Appalachian slopes in a breathtaking palette of fiery crimson, burnished gold, and deep russet, Mateo noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in Flicker in her growing offspring. Sol and Luna were now nearly as large as their mother, sleek, powerful young predators, their juvenile playfulness increasingly replaced by the focused intensity of seasoned hunters. Their blue kitten eyes had long since matured into the keen amber gold of their mothers. Under Flicker's patient and expert tutelage, they had mastered the silent stalk, the explosive pounce, the vital discernment of scent and sound that meant the difference between a meal and starvation and the uncompromising wilderness. Mateo began to see them less frequently around the familiar territory of the old den. Their tracks, once confined to the immediate vicinity, now ranged further afield, crisscrossing the ridge, exploring hidden hollows and venturing closer to rushing waters of Whisper Creek. He knew, with a bittersweet pang that resonated deep in his chest, that their time under his indirect, watchful care was drawing to its natural close. They were maturing, learning the ancient secrets of the mountain, preparing to claim their own territories, to become truly independent children of the wild. There was a profound sadness in that impending separation, but overlaying it was a deeper, more resonant sense of rightness, of a cycle completed. He had offered shelter and sustenance when they were their most vulnerable. Now, healthy and strong, they were ready to embrace their wild destiny. He continued his dawn patrols out of habit and a lingering sense of responsibility, though he found fewer and fewer signs of the poachers. Perhaps his quiet, persistent campaign of misdirection and trap removal had finally convinced them to seek easier, less frustrating hunting grounds. Or perhaps, as he liked to imagine, the mountain itself, with Flicker as its avenging spirit, had made them unwelcome. His workshop, once a dusty tomb of forgotten projects and painful memories, was now vibrant with new life. Finished carvings lined the shelves and filled the corners, each piece imbued with the spirit of the mountain creatures he had come to observe with such intimacy and respect. There was a majestic stag, its antlers like gnarled branches against a winter sky, a family of raccoons, their intelligent eyes glinted with mischief, and of course, numerous studies of bobcats in various poses, hunting, resting, playing. One crisp November morning, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, he took a selection of his best new pieces down to the Mountain Craft Co-op in Shiloh Gap. It was his first real foray back into the human world, the first time he'd actively sought out community and commerce in what felt like an eternity. Martha Haskell, who ran the co-op as an extension of her general store, and whose own husband had passed a few years prior, looked at his new work with wide, appreciative eyes. "Mateo," she said, her voice gentle, these are powerful. There's a fire in them I haven't seen before." Other locals browsed the co-op, echoed her sentiments, commenting on the raw vitality, the almost startling life force that seemed to emanate from the carved wood. He sold 3 pieces that day, but more valuable than the money was the quiet nod of recognition from his peers, the feeling of reconnection, however tentative. Later that week, he made his way to the area of Flicker's old den beneath the storm-fallen oak. It was empty, as he had known it would be. The shallow hollow was already being reclaimed by the forest, a scattering of freshly fallen maple leaves lining its earthy contours. Fresh tracks, 3 sets, 1 large, 2 slightly smaller, led away from the den not down towards the easier slopes, but up, inexorably up, towards the highest, most remote, and inaccessible peaks of Black Pine Ridge. Flicker, Soul, and Luna were gone, vanished into the vast, untamed heart of the wilderness. Mateo stood there for a long time, the profound silence of the late autumn forest pressing in on him. But it was no longer the crushing, oppressive silence of grief and loneliness. It was a living silence, filled with the phantom echoes of soft, chuffing calls, the imagined glints of the tiny blue eyes, the enduring memory of a fierce, protective love that had bridged the chasm between species. He returned to his cabin, a deep, abiding sense of peace settling over him like the soft mountain mist. Flicker and her family might be gone from his immediate sight, but they would forever remain a part of him, an indelible imprint on his soul, as much a part of the mountain he called home as the ancient rocks and whispering pines. He picked up a new, unblemished block of rich, aromatic cedar, its smooth, cool surface a promise beneath his calloused palm. Its scent filled his workshop, mingling with the lingering fragrance of walnut and cherry. He knew with absolute certainty what he would carve next. Not a portrait of a specific animal, but an evocation of a spirit, a wild, elusive bobcat, half glimpsed at the edge of a shadowed forest, forever vigilant, unseen guardian of the high ridges, a symbol of the enduring, untamable wildness that had, in healing another, also healed him. He was Mateo, the wood carver of Black Pine Ridge, a man who had walked through the valley of profound loss, but who, thanks to a wounded bobcat and her precious young, had found his way back to the sunlit uplands of life, his hands and heart once again fluent in the language of creation and connection. The mountain held its myriad secrets, and he, now in his own quiet way, was one of them.